So here it is, the prologue of The Miss Without a Mister. Summer 1816. Caroline Preston never felt more alive than on the summer night of a Northfield Hall festival. The air as warm as an embrace, the fields wafting a sweet, heady perfume, the sun clinging in tendrils to the horizon, refusing to submit to the dark's demands. All around Caroline, people celebrated, dancing around the great bonfire, jumping into the cold pond with shrieks, sitting under the lilac bushes for talks that lasted as long as the evening. Caroline could burst for how happy she was, and for this whole festival to be celebrating her 16th birthday, and to be in a new linen summer dress with embroidery to make a princess jealous, and most of all, for Eddie Chow, who had returned from London for 2 whole weeks to celebrate with her. Of course, his visit was not entirely about Caroline. It was one of his few holidays from his apprenticeship with a London glazier, and so he had spent most of it with his parents and 2 older brothers who lived in the family cottage at Northfield Hall. Still, Eddie, her best friend since before she could remember, was there for her birthday. Caroline really could burst with joy. She had lost track of him as the sun sank lower in the sky, distracted by a toast in her honor, followed by a folk dance performed by some of the maids from the north, and then there had been honey cakes and sweet wine to drink. Now Caroline spotted Eddie by the bonfire, on a boulder a little way from the logs. Gangly and tall, he had grown so much in London, yet boasted barely any flesh on his bones. He sat with his long legs stretched ahead of him, his dark hair and eyes looking black as ink in the firelight. Even with his lips drawn down, his expression slack, the mere sight of him made Caroline's heart drum in triple. On either side of him, fellow Northfield Hall laborers were engaged in animated conversations, but Eddie was still, silent, and staring into the fire. Caroline could almost believe he was morose, except this was her birthday, and they were in the same place again at last, and he had no reason to be sad. Skipping over to him, she held out her hand. Come with me. He smiled immediately, which had been the whole point. When he asked, Where? Caroline invented an excuse. I have something to show you. He took her hand long enough to stand, long enough for her whole body to leap like a flame in reaction to his touch. Then he dropped it. They were too old to run around the estate hand in hand like 8-year-olds anymore. A bittersweet truth. Bitter because Caroline wanted the freedom to touch Eddie whenever and however she wanted. Sweet because their age brought them closer and closer to the day when she could, as his wife, do just that. She led him away from the bonfire and the pond and the friends laughing under trees. There was a path into the woods that he might not know about, as it had been years since he had spent more than a week or 2 at Northfield Hall at a time. And he most likely wouldn't know the circular grove, as it had been newly created when the laborers had cleared a few trees for timber. And even Caroline didn't know what the night sky looked like from the ground there. They moved in silence. Caroline found herself holding her breath the way she had done as a child to avoid detection when she and Eddie tried to sneak away from their minders. She glanced over her shoulder as they entered the woods, but Eddie's expression was lost to the gray night. Out of sight of the rest of the festival, Caroline reached back and grabbed his hand. This time, his fingers intertwined with hers, and neither of them let go. There was much Caroline didn't know about Eddie these days. What it was to be an apprentice, beyond the platitudes Eddie recited when she asked. What food he ate in London. Whether he went to Covent Garden for the theatre, or the Five Dials for card games, or even to a church for Sunday sermons. She pushed the questions out of her mind, knowing the small details didn't matter, especially when Eddie never offered them. Caroline knew Eddie at his core, and she knew his core hadn't changed. He would always be sweet, thoughtful, and steady. Is this what you wanted to show me? Eddie asked when they reached the grove. Trees. Actually, I wanted to show you the absence of trees. Spreading out her arms, Caroline twirled with her head tossed back, excitement propelling her every movement. And there they were, stars, twinkling in the sky above the oval clearing. Tugging Eddie's hand, Caroline dropped to the ground and laid her body flat. They had lain side by side like this dozens of times. In summers past, they had whiled away afternoons counting clouds in the sky. They had named the constellations at night with their siblings. They had shared a mattress at nap time and kept each other entertained with fairy tales when they were meant to be sleeping. But then they had been children. Now, Caroline's mouth went dry from noticing Eddie's muscular arm against hers. She could measure the distance between their hips in yearning inches. She could smell his warm skin and the soft scent of ginger beer on his breath. She could hardly see the stars in the sky anymore. A question leapt from her heart. Have you fallen in love with anyone in London? Eddie turned onto his side. Suddenly he loomed over her, his nose only a breath or two away from hers. His lips were close enough, too, that even in the dark, she could see them clearly. What kind of question is that? An interrogatory one. Not rhetorical. I should like an answer, please. Have you fallen in love with anyone in London? And if so, with whom, and is she prettier than me? No, I have not fallen in love with anyone in London. Tentatively, Eddie reached out and removed a curl of hair from Caroline's forehead. She hadn't noticed it until he touched her. Now, even her hair felt alive with desire. Eddie looked at her with soft, mysterious eyes. No, there is no one prettier than you. Caroline found she could reply with nothing more than, good. And you? His voice was gentle as opposed to her playful brusqueness. Have you fallen in love with anyone while I have been in London? No. He didn't have a curl of hair on his face, but she reached out anyway and cupped his cheek. And there is none prettier than you either. Neither of them smiled at her joke. To tell the truth, Caroline had never felt so overwhelmed by her own body. Her breath and heart were out of her control, and instead of rational thoughts, she seemed able to comprehend only the feel of Eddie's warm cheek beneath her fingertips. Well, she said, because she knew she had something clever to say somewhere in her mind. Then our agreement still stands? Agreement? Eddie's thumb brushed down the sweep of her jaw. She hoped he asked because he was in a daze, like she was, and not because he had forgotten. To marry. They had first made the pact at the age of 11, after her sister Ellen's wedding, when they both supposed they would have to marry at some point, and as they wouldn't like it to be to anyone, it might as well be to each other. A year later, on the morning that Eddie was sent to his first apprenticeship in Reading, they had sealed the agreement with a kiss. A tentative kiss that hadn't felt like much of anything. A kiss that, nevertheless, Caroline had never forgotten. To marry each other, Eddie said slowly. On her skin, his fingers stilled. Yes. There was probably more to say. Caroline didn't have the patience for it anymore. She had wanted only to hear that Eddie remained hers. She plunged forward, a little too eagerly, their lips mashed together, and their front teeth clanged. She would have been embarrassed, except it was Eddie, and her body was on fire, and all they had to do was adjust their necks and their hold on each other, and then the kiss was perfect. Eddie was perfect. The night was perfect. Later, Caroline would wonder why they had not pushed further. She would wonder why they had not taken advantage of being alone on the ground to explore each other fully and to claim their love entirely. But that was when she was lonesome, when she was no longer anchored by Eddie's lips on her mouth and his ankles locking against hers. For now, she was 16, and love did not need to be proved, and she had Eddie all to herself. They kissed until they might not be able to do anything for the rest of their lives but kiss. Then somehow they extricated themselves. Eddie, always the one to save them from the worst trouble, removed himself first, though he clung to her hand as if she alone could pull him from dangerous waters. They lay panting at the stars for a while longer. At last, they returned to the festival, hand in hand, and when no one said anything, Caroline decided their love was preordained. It wasn't until much later that she realized Eddie's early return to London the very next morning had nothing to do with a letter from his master and everything to do with that perfect kiss. And only much, much later did she understand that if anything was preordained, it was not her marriage to Eddie Chow.
This ending is so ominous.
You'll have to read on to chapter 1 to find out what happens. Thank you for listening. We're going to take a quick break for our sponsors, and then Sarah gets to ask me any of the questions that she's always wanted to ask me.